So this is Cosmic Star Heroine. This is an indie RPG that is loosely based off of Chrono Trigger and Phantasy Star. So this game follows Alyssa, or Chrono, if you would, in her adventures to save the world, and, well, all of the worlds, actually. So this is the tutorial area. We're just learning the basics, of course. This game has a very interesting combat system compared to other RPGs, which is that instead of having mana, you actually have different abilities. You have 7 of them that you can have at a time, plus a rest. And except for very few attacks, once you use that attack, it's actually unusable until you rest, unless it's a once per battle thing. But so it's a very strategic RPG in the sense that you really have to strategize what you're going to do, because you can only do effectively 7 attacks before you have to rest. There's also the hyper meter, which Alyssa just activated there. So the hyper meter actually doubles the damage of your next attack. So it's a lot of working around the timing on your hyper, what abilities you're going to do, such like that. So right here, this is a really good opening. I managed to run by both of the battles there. It's similar to Chrono Trigger. The battles are all on the map, so if you can run around their hitboxes, you can actually avoid them. And those two, the first one's actually pretty easy to do, of the dogs. The second one's actually pretty difficult, and I was really lucky to get that. So this here is a pretty easy boss fight. You have exactly enough damage to kill this on the second rotation with Luca. And by Luca, I mean Chan. This fight here is actually pretty easy too. So he's weak to water. We use an item called... I actually don't remember what the item's called. I think it's Shield Breaker, which inflicts a vulnerable on them. And then we use Alyssa's hyper, so he takes 4 times damage, plus the elemental weakness, which I believe is an extra 50%. So that's the ending of the first level here. We meet 2 of the main characters, and we are going to save the tower from exploding from this terrorist known as Joff. He'll be coming back a little later, of course, but for now, we're going to end into the second area, and we're going to meet some new characters. So this is the robot factory, which is the front for the Space FBI. It's actually called the API. I don't remember what it stands for off the top of my head, but it's essentially the Space FBI. They protect the, well, space. Alyssa is one of the top operatives, alongside Echo, who is the lady standing at the bottom of the screen right there. They are the 2 top agents, and the gentleman we met in the cutscene was the director of the Space API, Director Steele. The gentleman in the tux we just had a talk with was Director Sue. He is the head of operations here. So he told us about another mission, gave us a little bit of money, sent us on our way. So now we are going to equip ourselves with some items for the next couple minutes, and we're going to head to the next area. So this is the first area where there is a theoretical skip possible. In theory, if you had very, very good inputs, you could do a skip, which would skip probably about a minute and a half here, but it requires about 15 to 20 perfect, I guess it's 30 to 40 perfect inputs in order to pause walk across some triggers. But missing that costs more time than the skip saves. And you do get a retry, but it wastes a lot of time. So this area here, since we equipped ourselves, we actually are able to 2-cycle this fight. If we didn't do that, we'd have to 3-cycle it. We'd be just a little short on damage. But so we're going to pick up the flamethrower here, which is used slightly environmentally, but is mostly just a really powerful move for Chan. So Chan is a gunmancer, so she can summon various guns. Dave is the third character. guess you could say Marl, but not really, because that's actually a different character later, sort of. It doesn't really have a correlation to Chrono Trigger. So Dave is a hacker, and actually is our strongest character late game. So there's 4 different stats in this game, each which track different things. So there's physique, which is, of course, physical damage and health. There is cunning, which is speed and the effect of your status ailments. There's spark, which is your magic ability. And then there's hactitude, which is the power of your programs. So on top of having your standard set of 7 attacks, there's also programs, which is usually once per battle effects that are attached to your shield, and the higher your hactitude, the higher your powers. Dave comes equipped with the strongest, not shield, but strongest programs attached to a shield in the game. All of them ignore all of the defenses of the enemy. So combined with a lot of stat raising and stat decreasing moves, he's actually able to do insane amounts of damage. Unfortunately, in order to unlock them, you actually require a certain amount of hactitude, so we have to wait until a little later on in the game before we're able to use his full capabilities. So we've managed to infiltrate this abandoned science research lab here. There's news going around that there's something very important here in the lab that the terrorist group is looking for. Also, it was I didn't miss it because I was going over explanation. There was a very large monster which murdered all of those people. So we were able to get a key card to get into the lab here, and we're being wary of what caused it. So inside the lab here, we're able to skip that first fight. A lot of these creatures are robotic, which means they are weak to water. This move we just used here is actually a pretty interesting move, but it's not actually utilized too much late game. It's called Envirohack, which has a different ability based on the area you're in. It's only really used when it can actually stun, because it gives you an extra turn before the enemy's attack. So you can set up a lot of different things. Also, it just saves a turn. So we're heading into the first boss fight here, which is the creature, what we believe, killed everybody outside. It's actually, again, pretty easy to get a nice cycle off on this because of hyper, vulnerable, and Dark Void here. Plus the stun, he actually doesn't get a chance to move at all. Now, this is a second part where we could do a skip. This one's actually pretty easy to skip. Well, I say easy. It's easier than most to get past the trigger by buffering your pause and walking. However, it actually is really easy to crash the game if you do that. So, now the group got separated after that fight, so we're going to be alone for just a couple minutes here. We're going to pick up an item here for Alyssa, which is going to help her damage a little bit, especially in the next couple fights. I'm going to switch to Dave and Sean here. Fortunately, most of the fights early on are able to pretty quickly 1 or 2 cycle them. Even though the characters are extremely weak at this moment, we're able to get past them pretty quickly. So Chan is actually one of the weaker characters in the run. She's useful. She's very useful early on because she has a powerful AoE combo early on in the game, but her damage doesn't scale that great into the late game, so it's actually better to replace her. AoE is one of the better parts of this run. It makes it extremely quick because you can get rid of so many enemies at the same time. Just doing a quick menu here to make sure that that weapon's equipped. We didn't need to use it before, of course. This fight is pretty self-explanatory. Same as most of the other ones. We're just going to throw down the vulnerable on the bigger one and then have Dave and Sean kill the smaller one off. Now, you'll notice I didn't have Dave attacking there, and it's because Dave actually only has 2 attacking moves currently, and actually for the rest of the run will only have 2 damaging moves. Well, he'll have a little more with his Void abilities once his Hackitude gets better, but he mostly only has 2. He has his programs and Zap. And a very weak against robotic one later on, but it's not really used. So on this cycle, I actually don't choose to use Vulnerable for Alyssa's Hyper, because I'm saving it for Dave's Hyper, which does a significant amount of damage more, just because it ignores the armor there. Fortunately, all of the buffs in this game are actually multiplicative instead of additive, so damages get significantly higher the more buffs and debuffs you throw on allies and enemies. So Arit there is the leader of the terrorist organization. She is the one who ran up at the end of that cutscene there. We'll be seeing a little bit more from her later, but for now we've actually come back to the headquarters, and Dave and Alyssa have found out that Steele might not be exactly honest with us about why he wanted the devices we got. It's called the Lumina device. And upon further research, Dave has figured out that he believes it could be used to control the minds of people. So now that we've just gotten the device for the API, we're going to go steal it. So even though it's late, there are still people walking around, of course, and the guards immediately realize we're not supposed to be here. So we're actually going to take out the guards. So this area here is a little bit of a puzzle. You have to activate the computers to close certain colors of lights in order to, I guess not close, in order to change where the laser fields are so you can get through certain places. This area here actually has 2 of the most important items of the early game. Actually, sorry, it has 3 of the most important items, but we won't be getting the 3rd one until on our way back. The 2 items we're going to be getting are the Speed Stick for Alyssa, which will make her hyper on her first turn, and the Focused Hana for Chan, which will add focus to all of her first attacks. Now, focus is an ability she has which allows her next attack to target all of the enemies on the field. So she'll start off with that at the beginning of every battle, which means she has extremely high AoE. Because she can actually focus twice if needed, but also because she can just start off the fight by using an attack. In most cases, we can actually work around this to make sure she kills all of the enemies first before they get a turn, or any other party members move after her. So in this particular scenario, they're actually all weak enough that just a regular attack will do it. We'll be getting some buffing items in a little bit, which we'll actually start being able to use on her to make sure that her damage is even higher. Now, there's actually not too many fights here, considering we're breaking into the vault of the Space FBI. There's only a few guards here. And you can see how the damage stacks up super quick with all of that. The enemy was weak to water. Alyssa had Hyper on, the vulnerable was stacked on it. It did almost twice as health and damage. So it's actually, the damage numbers get really, really high as the run goes on. Which is great because the enemy health gets super high as well. So now that we've got the Lumina device, we're making our way back out. However, it seems that Sue has heard of our exploits and has come to confront us. However, fortunately for us, Sue believes us more than he believes Steel, having suspicions of his own, which is compounded by the fact that Steel comes in and summons a giant metal dragon to kill us. So now we have Sue here. This is our the first time we have 4 party members, of course. Sue is pretty strong physically, and he has a lot of really nice earth moves. As well, he has a really, really powerful move when used or combined with Hyper. So we actually set it up here. He also has a move that gives him an extra Hyper bar. So we're actually able to set it up pretty nicely so we get a decent amount of Hypers and Vulnerables on him, and we do a significant amount of damage. As well, we also have a move now on Alyssa, which is called Knockout, which will inflict Vulnerable on an enemy. So we have 2 chances to inflict Vulnerable on most enemies. The downside or upside of that, depending on where you are in the game, is that the more times you inflict Vulnerable, the harder it is to hit. Now, however, if you miss Vulnerable the first time, which is possible but rare, the second one is more likely to hit. How status ailments work in this game, and actually before I go a little bit further, we just picked up an item called Buffs TM, or something like that. It's essentially an item in all of the Zeboid games. It's called something slightly different in each of them, but it increases your stats by 50%, which is really good for buffing and stuff like that. So the way status ailments work in this is that enemies and you actually have something called a status health bar or an ailment health bar, which is different for every ailment. And basically, if the ailment doesn't work the first time, it weakens the health bar, so the second time it is more likely to work. And it looks like it's just called Buffs in this game. Buffs TMs would be one of the other games. So we don't actually need to do too much on this one. We also have a move called Inspire on Alyssa, which I haven't talked about yet, which again is a buff, which doubles your... I believe it's 1.8 times damage. So there's a 1 in 4 chance of hitting a target we actually want to hit. We want to hit anybody who's not that one, because we hit him first try. Hitting him doesn't waste too much time, but it just allows an extra turn. So here we're going to do a little bit of split damage here. We're going to make sure that the Vulnerables and Hypers are set for the 2 more healthier ones, which are the one on the left and the red one. And we're also going to set up the Vulnerables on Dave and Sue here, because they do a lot of damage to these guys. With both the Vulnerables and Hypers down, you can one-shot. Well, I guess technically 2-shot them at this point, but... So we're almost at the end of the escape sequence here. There is one enemy left, which is called the Overseer, and it is one of the guards of the area, or the head guards, even though it is a robot. He summons 2 smaller enemies here, which will actually claw onto enemies, or team members, and take away their turns. However, with the addition of Buffs and Inspire, we can actually, and Hyper, we can actually get Chan's damage enough that we can kill them before they get a turn. We have enough damage here that we can get him before he summons another claw, which is something he actually does do if he gets another turn when there's none down. But fortunately, with all of the buffs, we can get him down before he gets a turn. So now we're entering New Genna here. This is actually one of the earliest places where you can do a significant game break. Or sorry, you could do a significant game break earlier on. There's actually 2 pretty big game breaks. Fortunately, they were both patched out, but one of them is an instant kill bug, which would kill anywhere between 1 and 3 enemies in every battle at random, which would be cancelled. The entire glitch would be cancelled if you exit out of the game. And the other is actually a sequence break, which crashes the game. So when we enter this area here, Sue leaves the party to go do other business. Now, upon first entering this area, the southern entrance/exit to the city is actually blocked off. You can't use it because you're forced to go out the back of the nightclub here. However, during the first patch, that actually wasn't disabled, so you could go through the southern entrance to the city and actually progress with the rest of the game while having Sue in the party, which is a problem because he doesn't get removed from the party. At the end of this area, we're actually going to be solo with Alyssa, and then we pick up 3 new party members. 3 party members that are not the current 4, and Sue is still in the bottom slot, so as soon as you collect that 4th member, the game crashes. So we've picked up Lauren here. Lauren here is an old friend of Chon and a member of the Resistance. There is a movement on the planet which has been working against the API for a while now, and she is one of them. She also has liaisons with the terrorist organization. So this fight here, there's actually a pretty interesting skip here. It's not technically a skip, but there is a character in the city which, if you talk to her, will give you a heads up that there's a bounty hunter looking for you. If you talk to them, that last fight there actually includes a very tough enemy, but if you don't talk to her, then the bounty hunter doesn't show up and you can breeze through the fight, which is nice because talking to her wastes time. So it's super convenient to just not talk to her and then not fight that enemy. So now we're heading to the Millennial Fair. The Freedom Fair. And we're gonna meet Finn. Finn is our cousin, or Alyssa's cousin rather, and a member of the local police force. So he has been tasked with, making sure that the Freedom Festival is secure and running smoothly. So we take a quick break to do one of the fair games, which is rock, paper, scissors. You have to beat it's a more or less a puzzle. She tells you certain clues about what will and won't be thrown, and then you have to win 8 games of rock, paper, scissors in a row. The order is always the same, so you can win no problem. And it gives you a item called Water Bash, I believe, or it increases water damage, and it's also a very strong weapon at the time. So Alyssa gets ambushed by Director Steele, and the idea was that she would be made to look like a martyr. They planned to have Echo assassinate her and then make it look like she was targeted instead of just a traitor. Of course, trying to cover the fact that he is trying to take over the world. So Zorx here shows up with a bounty on our head, so he tries to collect it. Lauren shows up, and our cousin Finn, of course, shows up as well to protect us. Fortunately, Zorx doesn't have a lot of health in this fight, so we can stun him and then kill him pretty quickly. Now, all of a sudden, there is a giant robot here, so we have to go defeat the giant robot before it takes over, or destroys the city. So we're going to stack our damages, of course, and get the feet down quickly as possible. Lauren is a very quick character as well, and she gets hyper on her first turn. So this is the first implementation of pausing the game here. You'll notice that the enemies still keep moving while the game is paused. So you can actually pause the game and their hitboxes will pass over you without triggering a fight. Now this one here is a lot harder to skip. Unfortunately, I didn't get it here. Just because of the way the dogs move, there's very little time for you to be able to actually get to a place where you could even pause the game for the hitbox. And the way they move is so sporadic that it's actually usually easier to take the fight, usually faster to take the fight than it is waiting on the side, just because of how unoften the lower one actually moves away from the wall. So we do get a little bit of extra experience here. It's not really necessary, and it doesn't really improve our damage numbers enough to give us less cycles on any of the later fights. But it does save time over just waiting the fight out. So now we run into Zork again, and it turns out there's a giant robot on the robot's head. So now the bounty hunter is looking to help us defeat the robot. Zork is a very, very strong character. His physique is through the roof, and he has a lot of very powerful moves. Usually his moves have a little bit of risk reward, so they'll do a lot of damage, but affect him negatively in some way. They'll either drop him to 1 health, poison him, stuff like that. So now that we've beaten most of the robot, we're actually going to go to the top here. Fortunately, with all of the buffs we have, there's actually just enough moves that we can kill all of them pretty quickly. On this one here as well, while there are 2 cannons on the side, you actually don't need to kill the cannons, you only need to kill the head. So we're able to... it actually doesn't matter which order you throw the buffs on Zorx and Alyssa. You can either buff her and hyper him, or hyper her and buff him. Either way, the damage will be just enough to get rid of it. Finn should touch a little bit on... Well, I'll get to Finn in a second here. So... somehow a toad got turned into a giant frog toad monster, similar to King Kong, I guess. So now we're stealing the robot we just took from the terrorist to kill the giant robot. Now, there isn't a faster way to do this than 6 moves, but basically you trigger it so that you use a move which increases the damage of the next attack you use. Then you use an attack which does more damage when it's hypered, and then you deal as much damage as you can with that. Now, going back to Finn. Finn is a very, very weak character. He focuses a lot on... I shouldn't say he's super weak. He's weak in the speed run. He has a lot of attacks that will deal or cause ailments and debuffs to enemies. And he actually... It does pretty okay at causing a lot of AoE debuffs. However, that's not actually something we're looking for, because while his debuffs are good, they're not vulnerable or anything that would cause them to take more damage, which is actually what we're looking for. We don't really care about how much damage they do, just how much damage we can do. So we've now taken a submarine to an underwater base, which is home of the terrorists, and we've agreed to help Arit, who, actually, they don't see themselves as terrorists, of course. They see themselves as a resistance. The FBI, or Space FBI, of course, wants to paint them as terrorists. So, we're now helping out the resistance. So going into this next fight here, all of the fights are pretty straightforward here. We had got a really powerful item for Alyssa, but we actually didn't equip it so we can manipulate Dave moving before her, because we want Dave to be able to hyper her at the beginning of all of these fights, because she now has a very powerful water move, which she's actually been using for a while. I just haven't brought it up yet. She's been using a move called Flood, which does a decent amount of AoE water damage, and all of them are robots, or most of them are robots, and are susceptible to water, so we want Dave hypering her at the beginning of every fight. Now here it gets a little awkward just because of the health of all the enemies, but we can still do a pretty decent cycle here. We don't even bother waiting for hyper on Dave, because he actually has enough damage to take it out, and then by dropping a vulnerable on Echo, Finn can take out the final enemy there. So now we're going to switch to the second party. While we were waiting around, we actually sent Laura, Chan, and Sue or Lauren, sorry, to go destroy an underwater base here. So there are actually not a lot of fights here. There's 2 of these Ghost Fists, which are pretty easy to kill. It is possible to skip them, but much like the enemies a little earlier, the dogs in the tower, they move very sporadically, and their movements are really hard to get around. So if you go for the skip and don't get it, it's way faster to just do it instead of waiting around. Because they can dance around you a lot and basically make you waste a lot of time while you try to skip it. So now there's a ghost fish monster here that we're going to fight. Fortunately, it's weak to fire, so we're going to go ahead and throw a vulnerable down. We're going to buff her up a little bit. So interestingly enough, I haven't really mentioned it earlier, but Sean has an ability called, I believe it's called, I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it repeats the last Gunmancy attack she used, so she can actually use her powerful ones twice, which is nice because Flamethrower is pretty strong against those that are weak to fire. One thing I'm sure you might have noticed at this point, but all of the characters have their own element. There's not any cross between them. So if you need water damage, you need Alyssa. If you need fire damage, it's Sean. Thunder would be Dave, so on and so forth. Earth, Sue. So now there's a second giant serpentine water ghost, which is a little stronger than the last one, but still pretty easy to take down. Couple buffs and ailments, and we're on our way. So we've successfully sunk the ship and taken off. We have now boarded the ship of the Space FBI, and we're going to go ahead and take the fight to them. So there's a couple key cards we need to take along the way. We also are now partying with Arit. Now, Arit has a very useful shield attached to her. It has Inspire, which is something Alyssa's had for a while. It also has Delegate, which is something we just got from Alyssa on her abilities. So now we have a very interesting set of tools we can use, because we have 2 Vulnerables, we have 2 Inspires, we have buff TMs, we also have Delegate on 2 people. So what Delegate does is it forces the character you use it on to take a turn immediately. So you can do really interesting things like, with both of the Delegates, you can have somebody do a double buff on themselves and then take a 3rd turn to get their hyper and do a very powerful move, which is actually something we're going to be using a lot, not only on Dave, but on another character a little later on. So here we're going to be abusing the Delegates as well as Vulnerables to make our AoE attacks and our very strong attacks very efficient and take out as many enemies as quickly as possible. We can also manage the hyperbars a lot easier without having to use hyper. One thing I haven't actually talked about is style. Style is an interesting mechanic in the game. It's a very similar mechanic to some of the other games. Normally you don't actually have it on player characters, it's normally only on NPCs. But as time goes on, enemies actually do get stronger. And in this game, they've actually added it a little bit to yourself. So if you look at the percentages on the right side of the screen, all of the characters have a certain amount of style, which goes up each time they use an attack. And based on the style they have, they actually do more damage. So each 5% of style is an extra 0.4 damage. Or sorry, excuse me, each 4% style is an extra 1.05 damage. Which is a really nice multiplicative thing, because you normally get about 20 to 25 each time you do an attack. So it starts to add up over time, especially once you're doing the delegate combos, where you have somebody delegating. For example, we're going to start delegating Dave twice, so that he can buff himself twice, and then use his dark magic, or dark programs, which is a really nice addition to his damage, because he buffs himself, and then because he attacked, he actually increases his style, which increases his damage, which is all multiplicative. So they abandoned the ship, actually, and gave it to us, so we actually have control of the ship now. We defeated the Oiz creature that was taking control of it, and now we're heading to actually a second planet in the game, in the hopes that we can figure out how to stop the Lumina device. We're actually looking for somebody in particular who is rumored to be able to help us, or have information about what we're looking for. So we're coming to New Rama, which is a mafia town, more or less. It's very western, like Old West. A lot of conflict there between the sheriff and one of the local casino owners, who pretty much everybody knows is a mob boss. So we show up here, we talk to the sheriff. We need to talk to him in order to be able to actually get through. And we're actually going to go talk to one of the inmates who was wrongfully accused of doing something. And we're going to pay his bail because he agrees to help us and be one of our support characters. So support character isn't something that's really been relevant until now. But you can actually recruit people to your ship that will help you from the sidelines. So up until now, we've been using somebody who's given us +5 physique. But now with him, we can actually change it so that we can do 25% more damage to robots, which is really helpful for the rest of the game, because there's actually a lot of robots in the main story, as well. The next area is pretty much only robots, so we're going to be able to go through it a lot quicker. So we actually ran into Umi there in the hotel, who is the main love interest of Cthulhu, and one of his greatest allies. So they are actually from another game by Zeboid, which is something they like to do a lot. They like to include characters from other games. And Cthulhu, they're both, of course, from Cthulhu Saves the World, which is a very interesting RPG, and I do recommend it. But Cthulhu and Umi are stopping by here. And Cthulhu is actually a very powerful boss, which gives a very, very strong late-game item. But we don't actually deal with him. The important part is Umi has a painting from the museum that we were looking for. So this is basically kind of a weird fetch quest where we had to go get the painting and deliver it to him, and in exchange for that, he'll give us an invitation to Ezio's party, which we're trying to infiltrate to figure out what he knows. We can actually grab the painting first and then just talk to him twice. And then we can actually go to the party. Now, the other thing we actually need to get is a party dress, which we're supposed to be going to one of the local shops and buying in exchange for doing another fetch quest. However, there's a weird bug in the game where if you've completed the game once on any save file, the dress is actually just always there, so you don't need to get it a second time. So now we've shown up and we've infiltrated the party here. So we actually run to the back there to talk to him because he has a little bit of insight on some weird things going on, and he mentions that there's a room underneath, and there seem to be some levers and things that can move. And also he mentions that some of the party members might know a thing or two about the password leading to Ezio's secret room at the top there. So we open both passageways, we listen into some conversations, and we get an idea of what the password is. So we go up and infiltrate it. On the side of the walls there was actually October, another character from Cthulhu Saves the World. So now we're going into this dark secret lab where, of course, Enzo, not Ezio. Enzo is waiting for us, and we actually get captured and arrested. Sue and Lauren also infiltrated the party, has servers and bartenders, but we're caught. So now we meet Clark, who is a very interesting character. Clark has a very unique style which revolves around, well, style, actually. Of note, he actually has a pretty decent hackitude. So one of the things we did before entering here was we pulled Dave's and Dave and Arit's shields off of them so that we could equip them to Clark and Sue here, because we want the programs on them. Because using this, we can actually sweep through this area a lot faster using the Void Magic. So the first area here, we just drop some buffs on Alyssa, and her water takes care of the rest. But moving into the next areas, we're going to be focusing a lot on Clark, who is only really strong in this area, and actually completely falls off after we get the rest of the characters back. He does have a really powerful move, which is called Self-Destruct, which you can take a guess at what that does. In exchange for him, he'll do a massive amount of damage to characters, which is really useful when you can either guarantee that you don't care which target it hits, or you can get down to a single character. So here we actually don't need to use it because he still has Void Magic, and 2 vulnerables will drop these to enough for Alyssa and Clark. Now you'll notice one thing I didn't mention is that he has a very weird hyper bar, which fortunately, because Chan and Sue are so bad, it doesn't really waste time, but Clark's hyper can be anywhere between 1 and 4 for that fight. It's completely random, and it's decided at the beginning of every fight. So if you get lucky, and it's actually random after that as well, whether or not he gets hyper. His bar is always random after a hyper is completed. So if you don't get good luck, you can just take a turn hypering him instead of resting, usually. But you can actually get really lucky, and then you can spend those turns buffing, which do save a turn, but usually don't impact too negatively. So now we're doing a very interesting skip here. This is very similar to the Brock skip in Pokemon Blue and Red, and one of my favorite skips of the entire game. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go all the way to the end of the area here. We're going to use this pause buffing here. And we're going to do something similar to what I was explaining earlier, which is we're going to move in a direction and pause the game at the same time. And if we can trigger the dialogue box of this gentleman at the same time we open our save menu, we can save the game and then reload the game. And when we reload the game, the flag reads that we've entered that dialogue, and there's no way to get out of that dialogue without just beating him. So we reload the game, and the game registers that he's gone, so we can run through him, which is really nice because he is one of the hardest fights in the game. Not that he's strong, it's just that he has 5 enemies, or 4 enemies around him, which have a lot of health, and we don't have good AoE with this cast right now. Flood doesn't do a lot of damage to them, and none of the other characters have AoE. And all of their damage, while it is single target, there's so many targets that it just takes forever no matter what. So we're out of this area here, and we're going to the swamps. So we've determined that there is a creature on this planet. I don't remember what his race is, but his name is Side, and he's the leader of his race, or one of the most influential members of his race. So we're going to go try and talk to him. So now we're doing a little bit of menuing here. We're setting up for a very powerful combo here. So we're taking the shields off Dave and Sue, Clark and Sue, of course. We're bringing in Dave and Arit. and we're throwing on some abilities to make sure that we have everything in place. So what we've done is we've given Dave cheat code and buff. I don't actually remember what the second one is called off the top of my head, but they're two very powerful moves. So one of them it's cheat code and bandwidth. So bandwidth will increase his effectiveness of programs, and it's only a self-target. Cheat code can be used on anybody, and it'll increase the damage of the next attack. So now the strategy is going to be delegate on Alyssa and Arit normally, depending on the battle. And then we can cheat code bandwidth, and then on our third turn we have hyper, so we can throw down a very, very strong void magic attack. Now this area here, you can skip all of the fights if you are very lucky and careful, and a lot of pausing to disable your hitbox. Some of them are easier than the others, like that one is pretty easy, you just need to wait for the cycle, but all the other ones are pretty difficult to do. There is a awkward backup strat for this fight, but it requires going out of your way to get a weapon, which you can give to Chan. Throw Chan in the party, and then you can buff her, and she'll do a decent amount of AoE. As well, this is something I haven't mentioned. I did mention we got a very powerful move or shield for Alyssa, but I didn't mention it until now, besides not equipping it so that we could manipulate the cunning, but she now has team attacks from Chrono Trigger. So she has 3 programs, 1 per each team member, which she can use to do various cool things. Dave's is actually increases the effectiveness of everybody's programs, and it's really the only one that's used. And I did actually misspeak a little bit. Cheat code and bandwidth is actually much later in the game. Right now, we only need cheat code on and all the other buffs, because Arit actually has a higher hactitude than he does currently, and we actually want it on her because A, it deals more damage, and B, she unlocks the other programs that we need faster. So it doesn't take away too much damage because we do still have the team program, but we have a lot of buffs coming in now, so she actually does way more damage than she needs to without the bandwidth buff from Dave. Plus, we can switch around their 2 shields, so he has the delegate, and since he moves first, it actually allows for some one cycling, whereas and faster one cycling. So we're entering to the main area here, and we have to do a little bit of running around to get some parts to re-enable the computer to scan for Cyb, and then we come to this area here. So this is filled with a lot of weird creatures, and fortunately most of the fights are skippable. Again, a little difficult to do some of them. Also, since we do have all of the buffs and everything, it is pretty easy to get by them if we do accidentally run into them, but it's not the end of the world. So this is a little bit of running around. Basically, there's 2 power cells on each floor we need to grab, which will disable and open doors and allow us to continue through the next area. So this is, of note, Lauren is actually stopped being useful a long time ago. She's basically only a buffing bot at this point, and she's actually going to get replaced pretty quickly. And we're going to start actually having a team full of very useful people instead of mostly useful people and somebody that just aren't effective in the speedrun. So this area here gets pretty tricky. The enemies in these next areas are very hard to get with, and there's actually a little bit playing against you. There is one enemy. It's on the leftmost room in the top corner. There's 3 enemies that walk around, and in order to get through them, you kind of hug the wall, and there's actually a pixel that pushes you out of the wall, and if you're really unlucky, forces you into the fight. Fortunately, if you're anticipating it, you can usually pause quick enough or react quick enough to prevent it from happening, but it is still kind of awkward. Again, because we have upgraded buffs and Arit has the shield, it's not too bad. And this is the one I'm talking about right here. And you'll notice there was a little stutter as the character model was pushed out a little bit. You can get really lucky here, and they could spawn all on the right side of the room, or they can spawn all on the left. If they spawn on the right side of the room, you can run up, no problem. So here's another area where we could potentially save time with a lot of frame-perfect inputs. There is a trigger right here, which sends us to this area. If you can skip it, then you could actually skip this entire fight and go just talk to Saib. It is important. I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier. It's not so much triggered lines as trigger zones. The trigger zones are actually pretty big, which is why it's so risky to do them. So this here is a pretty standard boss fight here. We're going to throw a bunch of debuffs down. We're actually very careful on our Reet to throw down the vulnerable instead of letting Lauren do it. If Lauren does it here, the style's actually not enough on a Reet to actually take out all of the damage. To deal enough damage to take the boss out. So we're very careful to make sure that she does it. As well, when she rests, she has a passive which will basically her main abilities are all focused on drones. So if she defends, it'll actually have a drone come in and attack, which will proc the vulnerability that Lauren used, and therefore will half the damage, which is really bad when you're stacking multiplicative damage effects. So now we're coming into here. And I haven't changed the party quite yet because I'm waiting for the big menu. But we've got Saib here, and we're actually forced to use Saib here, which isn't a bad thing because Saib is pretty strong. So he is kind of a bard, more or less. He focuses on songs that will either heal or hurt the enemies. And he actually has a really important buff, which is called Hyper Awareness, which increases the amount of damage you do when hyper. And it's one of the most powerful buffs in the game. On top of that, we can now start pretty effectively stacking 2 turns of powers, buffs and debuffs, instead of before where we couldn't quite fill 2 turns. So now for the really powerful monsters, we can pretty much use all of our turns to stack buffs and debuffs. So throw down a bandwidth, or not a bandwidth, a team attack from Alyssa. You can drop 2 delegates, you've got the hyper awareness, you've got some inspires, you've got buff TMs, you've got all this kind of stuff. Also, because we have a lot of tools, we can do some pretty interesting things, which we couldn't do without them, which is, since we have such diverse tools, depending on the kind of damage we need to do and how many enemies, we can actually pick and choose what kind of strategy we're going for. Since we have the delegates, if we just need quick damage, we can drop everything down on Arit, or whoever has the best AoE at the time, which is Arit or Dave. We can drop 2 delegates on them. They can do some buffing moves, or if it's faster, just wait. They can wait, and then they can deal the damage they need to do. If it's a longer fight, if there's more enemies that won't quite die, if it's a boss, we can skip the delegates. We can go for full buffing moves, and it makes it really nice because we have that kind of adaptability and diversity in our strategies. So on type of hyper-awareness, there's a program that we have a little later on, just adding to the buffs, which when all of your teammates are alive, you use a program, and then whenever your teammates are all alive, it increases the damage that everybody does. Which, towards the end of the game, is really the damage of whoever has the void magic. It is actually a pretty recent development as well to have void magic on a Reet here. Previously, you just kept it on Dave, and he didn't have enough Hactitude to actually use the third row of void magic, which is Void Wave, which is the AoE version, which is really, really strong, especially when you have multiple enemies. But doing some research and everything, found out that a Reet has just enough Hactitude here to actually unlock it pretty early on for this section, which makes it invaluable. Now, when an enemy is stunned, when a teammate is stunned, you can actually use Delegate to overwrite the stun and force them to take that turn. However, in this instant, it was better to just deal the damage because he was so low. One of the other possible strats, which I haven't really talked about, is instead of using buffs on your turn if you're delegated, you can actually just use one of the lower versions of Void Magic, because you usually buffed pretty heavily, so that, because some of the attacks don't actually only impact one move, it stays for a couple turns, so you can sometimes just throw down the weaker Void Magic and then use the second Void Magic. So this boss fight here, we're going to throw down a bunch of buffs and debuffs here. So we've got buff TMs, we've got hyper awareness. We threw down a vulnerable, it didn't work, but that's okay, because we're going to throw down a second vulnerable here, which actually does work. We're going to throw the delegate on a Reet, so she does get her turn, and we're going to Void Wave. It does just enough damage since the second vulnerable hit that we can do that without throwing down the rest of the buffs. Sometimes, depending on how the stuns go and how the turns go, you might not quite one-shot the boss, but it's okay because you have the two other Void moves. You can just have them go again, maybe throw down another buff or a Hyperize or whatever, and then you can actually go through and do it. So we're going to the third area here, or the third planet here. This area is a little unfortunate because it forces us to some party members, and it actually gives us a very, very weak party member for what we're looking for. So we show up here and we meet with the mayor, and the mayor comes to talk to us. And then he dies of poison in the drink that he was drinking, and everybody thinks we did it. Now, fortunately on this planet, the way arrests work are a little weird. They allow us to research and do some detective work of our own to try and prove our innocence. So we walk next door conveniently to a private investigator who agrees to help us figure out what happened. Now, basically what happened is the Space FBI knew we would come here, so they came in and set out to frame us. So they convinced the mayor to come talk to us and actually poisoned him themselves, so it would look like we poisoned him, and then we would get arrested. So we're able to track down some odd things about the body, the drink he was drinking, and some plans that were abruptly canceled. We come over here to a hotel where he, for some reason, had a room. We get some evidence that shows that he met with the FBI. And then we're going to go meet with a scientist, a friend of Orson's, our private investigator, who's going to do some tests, figure out exactly what's going on. And then we're going to actually go to the local food place because it's suspected that it was his burger that was poisoned. And we could figure out some evidence from there. So there is some pretty cool... I doesn't say I have a lot of time, but there are some pretty cool saving things you can do here, which is going to be shown at the end of the level here. But basically, when you reload a game, or reload a save, it'll bring you back to the... You'll basically be entering, except for a few odd circumstances, you'll basically be entering the room of whatever you saved in. So if you walked in through a certain door, when you save, you'll be walking in through that door again when you reload. Now, here at the end of this sequence, when we figure out we have all of the evidence we need, we're going to be transported to this door here. And it's actually not something because we got transported to this room here, the last door we entered was that door. So when we save, it actually brings us back to that door because it was the last door we entered, even though we were obviously in a different building, and it just brings us a little bit closer. So we're going to exit and leave, and we're going to come back in here. We're going to talk to this lady here. She is one of the best supports in the game. She gives a +5 to every stat, which is helpful for all kinds of things, besides just doing more damage. It allows us to unlock hackitudes faster. So this cave here, I've said this about a lot of fights, but you can skip most of the things. It is a little difficult. We're actually going to run into Zork here. Zork, the very difficult to pronounce alien bounty hunter. Now the strategy, the strategy on this planet has changed a little bit from time to time. There was a time when we would actually pull Inspire or the Inspire shield and the Dark Magic shield off here. That's a very recent skip discovered, by the way. If you hug the back wall, you're just on the outside of the frame, so you can't actually be caught. So this strategy, this strategy has always been like this. This strategy here is Hyper Cacophony. Saib has a very strong move, which will end... He has two of them, so he can he'll end his song early to either heal or hurt. And the healing one is very, very strong. So we get a little unfortunate here with the stuns because Saib does get stunned, and we would have rathered him to get a turn so we could have 2-cycled. But because he gets stunned, we can throw the Delegate down, but it still takes an extra turn. So the strategy has evolved over time. We used to take Dark and Delegate here. We would throw Dark on Saib, of course, who has one of the higher hackitudes in the game. But we actually did some looking into everything, and there is a different combo we can go with, some movesets and stats and everything that do work. Part of the thing that helps a lot is the buffs here. Buffs, because it increases your damage and also your hackitude and everything. It's basically a flat increase for all stats, which means it benefits every character equally. We have just enough damage to kill some of the enemies we didn't used to have enough damage for. Now, this here is a pretty big skip. You can use a pause if you really want to, but you can't actually get away with it. I go a little risky here and actually just forgo it, which wastes a little bit of time, but fortunately with the new strat we can actually do a lot of damage here. So we're going to throw a lot of buffs on Zorks, and he's going to use a move which increases his damage significantly, but reduces the amount of money we get at the end. And money isn't a problem for us, so we don't really care. Now, this fight does waste a little bit of time. should have been a little safer with the pause. Not too much can be done about it. It is a pretty easy skip if you take it carefully. I rushed it a little bit. So we're actually going to come into this area here, and we find Echo is bleeding out almost, and she tells us that Steel has gone insane. So we're going to go ahead and go fight him. So this part is pretty standard. We're actually just going to throw as much as we can down on Saib so he can cacophony. We throw the vulnerable down here because we want to make sure he's vulnerable. We would take it a little slower if the vulnerable didn't land, and we would knock out and then go from there. But fortunately, it does land, so we can 2-cycle it pretty quickly. So this next fight here is a little awkward because he does summon some enemies, which can be a little annoying. But fortunately, we do have a pretty strong plan here. So I do miss the initial Inspire, but it doesn't matter too much. We're going to throw as many buffs down on Zorx as possible, because he is going to use his... he's going to combo some moves, which I haven't really talked about. He has a move which deals a significant amount of damage. The more weakened he... the higher his health is, the more damage he will do. As well, we drop all of the buffs on him. With the... there's also a defensive thing on side. When he defends, it increases the attack of all the characters, so that's pretty nice as well. So this here, we're going to go pick up another item for Dave. So the last item we're going to pick up, it's called the Robo Wrecker. So on top of being a very strong attack or weapon and increasing his damage output, it also has Robotic Bane, which actually stacks with the other Robotic Bane we have, which means we're going to be dealing a significant amount more damage to robots. Additionally, well, I shouldn't say additionally, the final area, all of them are robots, so it's just incredibly better to have that. So we're going to pull and switch around some items. We're going to leave Corion for now, because there are some enemies here that are not robotic. And we want the +5 stats here for the little bit of extra damage. So this area is a little scary. Not in the sense of dying, but so much so that some of the fights can be a little buggy. There's a lot of safety saves to be done in this particular area, just because sometimes the game decides to crash. Fortunately, you only have to redo the fight, basically, so it's not too bad. So this here is one of the scenarios where we just drop down some double delegates. Dave will buff himself, and then we'll be on our way. So most of these fights here are skippable. That was the first one that really wasn't, or the only one that really wasn't. A lot of the skips are very, very tight, though. You have to hug the wall and go very slowly. Fortunately, they're all stationary, so you can take your time and kind of just play with it a bit. And by play with it, I mean, like, hold the wall. This one here, I'm taking it very careful. I'm just hugging the wall here. It is one of the hardest ones to do. So now we're going to be heading to the second final boss fight here, which is going to be Steel. So we've stacked ourselves so we have as many buffs as we can. We are forced to have a read here, which is okay, because she actually has a really high hackitude, so... We are going to switch to Robotic Bane here, because the next boss is Robotic, of course. We only really kept that stat on for the first fight. If we take Corey off there, then it doesn't actually kill there. Now, I did say Corey was going to be one of the best supports in the game. We don't really use it a lot, but the amount of time it saves for when we use it is incredible. That area is very, very difficult without her. So the vulnerable doesn't actually work here, which is fine. We're going to try a second one here. The damage, even without the vulnerable, you can still do enough damage with 2. Fortunately, the vulnerable does drop, so we're able to skip having to 3 cycle. So we've defeated Steel, and turns out that Arit might not have been as good as we once thought. When she was working on the Lumina device, it seems like she lost a part of herself there. Either the device took control of her, whether it had a mind of its own or whatnot, it's hard to say, but Arit might not be all there anymore, and she's actually turned against us. So she's stolen it, and she's gone to this giant final dungeon here. So we're going to set up our final party here, which is Dave, Saib, and Zorks. We're going to save, most importantly, and we're actually going to straight up save and quit. The reason for that is this area, for whatever reason, it likes to crash at this first fight, so saving and quitting immediately seems to get rid of that. So now we're heading into the final area, of course. Like I said before, they're all robots, so we can use the 2 Robotic Banes to our advantage here. And we're going to stack as many buffs as possible. Now, I've actually moved Delegate away from Saib and onto Zorks, who has just enough to use Delegate at this point. The reason being is that Saib has 2 buffing abilities that are pretty good, whereas Zorks is limited only to the items he can use. He doesn't actually have any buffing abilities, so he is better off used for delegating than Saib, who has hyper awareness, who has his defense buff, who has all of that. So it also is nice because Zorks goes later than Saib, so I can get buffs on Dave when I need it, instead of having to possibly wait for a second cycle. If 2 delegates and some buffs will do enough damage to cycle, instead of having to let the enemies go and then Dave's final turn do it. Putting the delegate in the 3rd slot is actually worse because we can't do a full 2 cycle or a 1 cycle if the buff on the 4th slot is something we need, of course. So this enemy is pretty tough, so we're doing a standard 2 rotation. We're doing a standard 1 rotation. Or, I guess technically a 2 rotation. We opt not to do both vulnerable, or both delegates, because the vulnerable is actually so important. So this fight here is pretty quick. We're just going to drop 2 delegates here and do some buffs. With all of the robotic banes and everything, it's enough to 1 cycle of the Void Wave, so... The defense up here isn't actually needed, but it's the fastest move he has, so we've got to use it. It doesn't hurt that it increases our damage, but it's not necessary to actually defeat those enemies there. So now we're going to be heading into the final bosses here. There are several stages, of course. We're going to throw down a quick save. It is extremely unlikely, but this boss can instant Dave before he has a chance to move, and the only person in the game who has a revive up to this point is Dave. The only other person who has it is Alyssa, but she doesn't get it till a lot later on, and it also requires her to have style, which she won't have at this point in the fight because she's been buffing. So we opt to not vulnerable this fight, because it usually doesn't even hit on her. So instead we drop the vulnerable for a different buff, which isn't quite as effective as the 2 times she would take from vulnerable, but it does guarantee the damage is increased. And since we don't need the vulnerable particularly on this fight, we can skip it instead for something that actually increases the damage meaningfully. So now her mind has phased with this robot called Eternity. All of the rest of the fights are actually safe. That first one is the only one where you risk actually having Dave die. The rest of them don't deal enough damage on their first cycle. And you'll notice I'm actually delegating here because I have enough damage without all of the other buffs, so we can actually do a quicker kill on this fight. So this one here, we're going to opt for more of a full attack here. The arms on the side are weaker, so they'll take they'll take the same amount of damage, but their health is lower, so they will die a little quicker. And now this next fight, the arms on the side actually have like almost infinite health. However, they aren't required to kill. You can just kill the main hub here, which is also the final boss. So we're going to go for a pretty standard cycle here. We're foregoing the delegate here, instead going for a full 2 cycle instead of a delegated 1.5 cycle here. We will throw all of the buffs Dave can on. We're going to vulnerable, which almost always hits. We're going to defense up here, and then we are going to delegate. You can drop a second vulnerable, and it won't ruin the fight, but that's it. That's Cosmic Star Heroine. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I